Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on Assassin's Creed Unity. This is the 8th main game in the Assassin's Creed franchise, and it was developed by Ubisoft Montreal and released in 2014 for PC, Xbox One, and PS4. And while critics generally gave it mixed to favorable reviews, most of the player base seems to absolutely despise it, and honestly I can't really blame them because this thing launched and it was practically unplayable. It had an absolutely excessive amount of glitches, and it was painfully obvious that it was rushed out the door to meet the deadline. At the time of its release, barely anyone could get anything remotely resembling a stable frame rate, and now, even several years later, with much better hardware, we still can't get stable frame rates just because it's so poorly optimized. I mean, hell, I run a GTX 1080 now, and it still can't maintain even really 40 frames a second, let alone 60. The frame rate just tends to fluctuate all over the place, and that gets pretty irritating after a while. And it's a real shame too, because when you crank all the visuals up to the max, the game actually looks really good. They've put an absolutely massive amount of detail into the environments and even the character modeling and animations. As far as recreating the visuals of the French Revolution, they've done an absolutely outstanding job. It's just that because they didn't optimize the game, it runs like crap, and thus you can't really enjoy the visuals. It is much easier to enjoy the sound design though, because generally speaking the voice acting is very well done, although it still kind of baffles me that, like in all of the other Assassin's Creed games, they only use snippets of the native language of the characters. So instead of everyone speaking French and just having subtitles, they speak English with English accents, and occasionally put in a French word or phrase here or there. I mean, they don't even try to put on a French accent, they just use English accents the whole time, which in turn reminds you of movies that take place in France, but unfortunately everyone's speaking English with English accents instead. It's something of a missed opportunity there, especially considering that Ubisoft has major game studios in both Montreal, which is where this one was made, and more importantly for this particular instance, in Paris. I have absolutely no doubt they could have very easily found native French speakers and had them perform all of the voice acting for the game and then just put subtitles on it, but they just chose not to. Certainly not a deal breaker, but it is a bit unfortunate. Then of course there's the sound effects and the music, where the music is pretty decent orchestral stuff that works rather well for what you would expect for the French Revolution, but unfortunately it is pretty forgettable. And the sound effects are nothing remotely impressive either. They do their job decently, but there's nothing in there that really stands out as being particularly great, and of course the gunfire and explosion sounds are fairly wimpy as well. But what ultimately led me to decide that this was going to be an MTO rather than a full review were the story and the gameplay. The story is, like all of the Assassin's Creed games up to this point, split into two different sections. You have the meta story, which takes place in the current day, and you have the story that's within the Animus, which is what takes place during the French Revolution. And much like always, you disproportionately care about one more than the other. I'm going to give you a hint here. It's not the meta story. I don't know a single person who gives a single solitary fuck about what's going on outside of the Animus. All of the interesting stuff is in the historical fiction elements. All of the meta story elements are what nobody cares about because they're boring. At least with the previous Assassin's Creed games, up to Assassin's Creed 3 anyway, they had stuff going on outside of the Animus that could actually be interactive, instead of just going from point A to point B and then maybe pressing a button. There is absolutely no point whatsoever in including the metafiction in the Assassin's Creed series post-Assassin's Creed 3. Because after Assassin's Creed 3, there was no way they could have really continued the metafiction, so they decided to do something incredibly stupid. They basically made you a beta tester for the Assassin's Creed series by Abstergo Entertainment. In other words, they had absolutely no idea how to make the metafiction work, so they just cobbled together something that makes absolutely no sense and said, screw it, this is fine. Newsflash, Ubisoft. It's not fine. Nobody likes your metafiction. Stop putting it into your Assassin's Creed games. Instead, focus on what people actually care about, which is the historical fiction. In this particular case, you play as Arno Dorian, who is an assassin who doesn't know he's an assassin until a bit later on into the game, and he is actually thrown into the Bastille at the beginning of the game, being framed for his foster father's murder. While he's in the Bastille, he meets another assassin who ends up becoming his mentor. And then of course all hell breaks loose on Bastille Day, and they end up breaking out of the Bastille together and go off to join up with the Brotherhood. Now before all of this, you're put into an introductory segment that shows you what Arno is like before he becomes an assassin. And it's kind of painfully obvious that they're trying to recreate Ezio, but not Italian. He's a troublemaker, definitely a bit of a smartass, and he has a thing for his foster father's daughter, Elise. So right from the get-go, you're introduced to a character who's cracking wise, who's constantly getting into trouble, and who has a thing for the ladies, or at least one particular lady, I should say. And for those of you who are familiar with Ezio, that's going to sound very familiar. Arno's certainly not a carbon copy of Ezio, but he's similar enough that it's pretty painfully obvious they're trying to recapture the magic of Ezio in Assassin's Creed 2, they just don't do it anywhere near as gracefully. And throughout the course of the game, Arno just becomes more and more of a bland and uninteresting character, so you don't really have too much to go on there, and when you look at the actual events of the story, they don't really help either. As I said before, this takes place during the French Revolution, and that should be absolutely fascinating, except that they never really do all that much with it. Oh, don't get me wrong, they do shoehorn a few historical figures into the game here and there, and they do try to make certain elements coincide with main events of the French Revolution, but that all is really nothing more than backdrop to the Assassins versus Templars story that we've grown exhausted of over the years, and which is really not advanced in any meaningful way by this particular game. Although frankly that's not really at all surprising given that the meta story has not really been advanced much at all since Assassin's Creed 3. So at this point, the meta story is more of a vestigial remnant of Assassin's Creed 1 through 3, and unfortunately they just can't seem to ditch it. It ends up ruining the historical fiction because then they have to tie it in with the artifacts of Eden and the war between the Templars and the Assassins. Well, you can have the war between the Assassins and the Templars just fine, but when you've got all the artifacts of Eden going on and the meta-story elements with Abstergo entertainment and that sort of thing messing with the entire structure, you end up with a story that just ends up becoming extremely weak. And until Ubisoft realizes that absolutely no one gives a shit about the meta story of Assassin's Creed, and thus they don't need to include it in their games anymore, and then decide not to include it in their games, well, they're just gonna run into more problems with that. But the one thing that ultimately destroys Assassin's Creed Unity is not its story, it's the gameplay, which is basically the same as every other Assassin's Creed game to date. Oh, don't get me wrong, they did make a few changes here and there. The most notable one is the inclusion of co-op multiplayer where you can play with up to 4 people in total, except that you can't actually play the co-op anymore because absolutely nobody is still playing this thing. But aside from introducing co-op, they did actually make a few changes to the core gameplay. There's now free-running up and down actions as opposed to what they had before, which was just basically hold the trigger and thus you are free-running. For people who've played the previous Assassin's Creed games, it's a bit of an adjustment period, but once you get used to it, it's not that big of a deal. It's just a different way of handling it. The selection of equipment has pretty greatly expanded, so now you have quite a lot of swords, axes, guns, and such to choose from, with the idea there being you're going to tailor the gear selection to your own specific playstyle as well as just upgrade it over time naturally. Reality is, though, that it's basically the same system that they had before, it's just that there's more stuff to get now. They also modified the combat system a bit. Now it's no longer just press B to instantly wipe out any enemy ever. It's press B and then hammer the X button until they fall over. It's still an incredibly tedious and ridiculously easy system, so it's not like that was really an improvement. They also implemented a few slight changes with regards to the stealth mechanics. Now it functions like a bog standard stealth system at absolute best, which is admittedly an improvement over basically non-existent stealth, so there is that. But of course the thing is, it's only bog standard when it's working well, and it never works well because the AI in this game is incredibly dumb. Not to mention the numerous glitches the game has, so the stealth system may as well not even exist. But really, when you get down to it, the game's biggest problem is that it's too much like the previous games. They didn't really change up enough mechanics, and they didn't really improve things enough for it to really matter. With the story and characters being as weak as they are, ultimately it falls to the gameplay to bring things up, and all you have there is the most generic Assassin's Creed experience you could possibly imagine. If you've played a game in the series since Assassin's Creed 3, then you've pretty much played Assassin's Creed Unity, it's just with some very, very slight tweaks that barely even make a difference. It's still an open world game that doesn't really use its open world very well, the various side missions are bland and uninteresting, the various main missions are generally pretty much doing the same thing you're doing in the side missions, just on a bit of a longer scale. I say longer and not larger because the size of the missions is still the same, it's just that it takes longer to actually do them. There's still a lot of collectibles scattered all over the place. You still have to climb towers in order to get your synchronization going, in order to reveal parts of the map. And most importantly of all, the game is still way too frickin' easy. It just becomes extremely boring extremely quickly. Within the first hour, I was already bored beyond belief, and that's the worst thing that can happen with a video game. If a game is bad, I can actually work with that, because I can channel my irritation into drive to actually finish the game. Because even a bad game is going to be more memorable than a boring game. Think about it this way. If a game is boring, then that means that the writing and gameplay mechanics are not good enough to be interesting, but neither are they bad enough to be irritating. They're in this really awkward middle ground where they're just tedious. And in a game as long as Assassin's Creed Unity, that becomes a really nasty problem. The game's about 30 hours if you do the main content as well as some of the side content. Not necessarily all of it, just some of it. And obviously your playtime is going to vary depending on how many collectibles you go after and how slowly you take all the missions. But let's say you go through it at a fairly meandering pace, you play through the main story content and you play through some of the side missions, and you end up about 30 hours. Well, it's going to wear thin by hour 2. And whether or not you're going to enjoy the rest of the game is going to depend entirely on how burned out you are with the Assassin's Creed games, and how much you can put up with the mind-numbing tedium of the mechanics and the story. And with that in mind, it's extremely easy to see why the reception to Assassin's Creed Unity was so negative. Not only is it an unfinished, buggy as hell mess of a game with really poor performance, it's also just badly written and badly designed enough to where it's not outright bad, but it's just extremely boring. And frankly, that's just not worth bothering with. I'll still take a look at Assassin's Creed Syndicate since I already have a copy of it, and I'll probably take a look at Assassin's Creed Origins simply because the setting is interesting to me. But I'm certainly not picking up Origins at anything remotely resembling full price. It's going to be basically a $10 or less kind of game. Maybe the 3 games in the Chronicles sub-series of Assassin's Creed will be a bit more interesting because they are a completely different perspective and they play very differently from the mainline games. So maybe that'll actually work out in their advantage whenever I get around to those. But as far as the mainline Assassin's Creed series goes, it's gotten so pathetically stale that it's just kind of sad. I can think of absolutely no reason whatsoever to recommend Assassin's Creed Unity unless you are an absolute diehard fan of the Assassin's Creed series and you must own every single one. But for a general audience, for people who are maybe looking to get into the Assassin's Creed series or maybe only play one entry every so often, there are much better options out there. If you're going to play an Assassin's Creed game, I still can only wholeheartedly recommend Assassin's Creed 2. Which, if you take that in the context of Unity, is actually pretty amusing, because it was kind of painfully obvious they were trying to recapture some of the magic from Assassin's Creed 2, and just ended up failing miserably at it. Thanks for watching. I'll catch y'all in later videos.